kit back up on the bench. It's had 10 coats of clear gloss and about 5 days to dry. From here, what we want to do next is start flat sanding that clear gloss. So hopefully you can see, especially where the light's reflecting off the body, there's a peel effect, or an orange peel effect to the paint. And what that's really telling us is there's areas of unevenness in our paint, and that's why the light's reflecting differently. So what we want to do next, taking about an 800 grit paper, something fairly fine, and a nice hard sanding block, we just want to start working that unevenness out of the paint. So I'm not sanding aggressively. When I'm doing this, I'm just working the paint and removing that shine. As you can see, there's already quite a difference there. There's less shine to that area, but we also don't have that peel effect. And that's really what we're trying to do right across the guitar. So I'm going to sand this for the next few hours using my 800 grit. I'm going to be careful around the edges because the paint doesn't accumulate well there. And we'll check back in and see how progress is going then. So I've been sanding for a couple of hours now, and hopefully you can see on camera we've removed almost all of that orange peel. There might be a few little specks here and there, but generally the next finer grit of paper will remove that. So I'm moving up now to a 1200 grit paper. I'm just repeating the same process. I'm just basically just removing the scratch marks left from the previous grade of paper. This stage normally doesn't take as long as the initial sanding. There's obviously less work for the paper to do. So I've finished up with the 1200 grit now, and if I hold the guitar up to the light, hopefully you're seeing a reduction in those scratch marks. Admittedly, white's a little hard to see on camera, but that's another thing to keep in mind. If this is your first guitar and you're choosing a colour, white's actually a pretty forgiving colour, unlike black, which will tend to highlight every scratch that you leave in the guitar. Okay, so from here I'm going to get onto a little bit of wet sanding. Now I've left this 1500 grit soaking overnight, and you don't need to do that, but it's generally recommended. It softens up the grit, and the paper's just easier to work with. So from here, again, I'm just going to use my sanding block. Now it's important to use a fair bit of water when you're wet sanding. Now you don't have to wet sand again. If you do, generally I like to work with a higher grit paper when I do that. Now a couple of things to keep in mind when you're wet sanding guitar bodies. Obviously we've got holes on the body themselves, and water gets in those holes. There's ingrain, unsealed timber in there that's going to swell up if it gets too moist. So definitely have a rag nearby, and just continually be removing any moisture that accumulates around those holes. So I'm not sure if this is showing up on camera, but certainly from my perspective, I can still see some tiny scratches, but you really need to have the guitar on an angle and reflecting light to see that. So as I said, you don't need to wet sand. It's just a final step I do before using a fine grade steel wool. So I've finished the wet sanding, and now I'm just going to follow up with some fine grade steel wool. So this super fine grade steel wool you can generally pick up at your local hardware store. And what this will essentially do is remove any scratch marks left from the previous high grade of paper. So I've been polishing away over on this side for the last couple of minutes. I'm just going to hold the guitar up to the light. As I said, it's difficult to see in these lighter colours, but I hope you can see a matte finish there. I'll bring the guitar down. I'll bring the camera down, sorry. And hopefully you can see now there's no scratch marks left there, but we've got a much duller finish compared to, say, over here. And that's what the steel wool does. It gives you that matte finish. And if you wanted a matte finish on your guitar, you could pretty much stop after this stage. Now, when you do use steel wool, a lot of people don't like using steel wool, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Generally, when you're using steel wool, it leaves a lot of steel fibres on the guitar, so that can be a problem. So if you're using steel wool and a lot of fibres get caught up in your cavities, for example, and your next stage is polishing, you may turn the guitar over and those fibres end up in your workspace. And as you're applying a lot of force while you're polishing. You're pressing those fibers against the surface, and also because you're heating up the surface when you're polishing, those steel fibers are likely to embed into the guitar more. And the other thing to keep in mind also is with regards to hardware and electronics, especially the pickups, which are essentially magnets. We don't want any steel fibers left on the guitar, so that are going to be drawn to the pickups. So what I suggest, I still use steel wool myself. I think it's worth doing, but you do want to give the guitar a thorough clean off afterwards. So as I said, we've got a nice matte, dull sort of finish from here. We're going to bring that gloss back by applying some polish. So I've got two grades. I'm just using an automotive polish here. I'm firstly using a cutting compound, a heavy duty cutting compound, and I'll follow that up with a super fine cut. And I've got two clean rags here. And really, if you've ever polished a car before, it's the same situation. We're just rubbing in the polish, and we're working it pretty hard. Again, this is why it's a good idea to have definitely removed any metal fibers from the steel wool at this stage. And I'm just really working that almost as hard as I can into the paint. I've finished polishing up the TE body. As you can see, we've got that nice reflective surface back on the guitar, that nice glossy reflective surface. Now I've just used automotive polishes for that, so I had a heavier grade polish first, and